Garcia as the reference model maven, and now you're going to get to meet her as presenter extraordinaire when she tells us about defining strategic business objects. Take it away.
Thank you, Mike. And actually, I'm going to talk about strategic objectives for my topic and how business architecture helps to create laser focus. The volume? Yeah. Can you all hear me? Okay.
We can hear you online.
So as we get started, I want to, I know most folks know about Wells Fargo, but just to tell you about the organization as a whole, we'll talk about the purpose and where I'm going to focus in terms of the domains for business architecture. And just to be very transparent, as we have over the last 2 days, about some of the challenges and how those were resolved, and then kind of go into a little bit about defining the strategies, objectives, goals, and the KPIs, and then summarize some of the key takeaways. So Wells Fargo is we're managing about $2 trillion in assets. We serve 1 in 3 U.S. households, and more than 10% of the, I think it's about 30 million small businesses in the U.S. We have a diversified portfolio. There's 4 reportable operating segments, but when you'll see, I'll talk a little bit about where I sit in the organization. There's actually a 5th one that's sort of reports under the consumer banking and lending. What drives us in terms of our social impact is around promoting housing affordability, small business growth, financial health, and also having a low carbon economy or carbon footprint. Fortune ranked us number 41 in the 2022 ranking of businesses, and I think we're probably the 3rd largest bank. And just because today my case study, the transformation that I'm working on relates to payments, I thought a fun fact might be to know that we are the #1 originator for ACH. So anytime you do, online bill pay, or, pay your mortgage or your, car loan, and a lot of your check deposits, all of that's ACH. And it's about 8 billion transactions per year. So where I sit in the organization, so also disclosure, I used to be part of the enterprise business architecture team, but they have disbanded that. So just to kind of ward off any questions about how big is your team, et cetera, I'm now working in a transformation team within operations. And I do have a couple of, there's another person at least that has some exposure to business architecture, and there's other teams in the organization that are kind of under the label of shared services that do something similar in terms of thinking about inventorying what they call services. We look at organizations, but they're called risk accessible units. So there are pockets of the organization that are doing similar business architecture work, but my focus is on transformation. So where I sit is in this operations team, and we focused in terms of our objectives for the strategy was to focus on how we can improve customer experience, mitigate risk, efficiency, and cost savings or avoidance. During this presentation, we're not going to talk a lot about our creating the strategy map. We actually had created a strategy map using like Norton Kaplan, that framework. And just because of the nature we sit, kind of like one removed, if you will, from the customer, most of our focus was around the internal perspective of the strategy map. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So what is the purpose of the presentation? So we'll talk about strategic planning, and it really does set the long-term direction of an organization. It's not, things that you'll accomplish, in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It is, what are you doing over multiple years? And so it takes a lot of focus and coordination across your organizations. Strategy makes sure that you're all on the right path. And then the objectives make sure that you're collectively moving in the same direction. It's also critical that you have metrics that articulate the organization and how they're going to measure effectiveness of those objectives and the investments for those initiatives. I assembled a group of, product owners, initiative leads, some of the various leaders in the organization, and like a broken record, how are you going to measure the effectiveness? How are you going to measure that what we are building, the capabilities that we're enhancing are effective and that they're going to achieve the outcomes and the goals that we have set? So in order to create laser focus on the most important outcomes, it's critical that we understand, how we're going to measure our return on investment. One of the leaders that I just started following is Dr. Chuck, is it Branford? And one of the things he said, he'll ask leaders, what are your employees doing when you're, in meetings? When you're in meetings, what are your employees doing? And usually they'll answer the question like, well, I hope they're working. But you really could, well, you're like, I do hope they're working. But he's like, well, he said, right answer is you hope they're achieving your strategies. But if they don't know what activities tie to those strategic objectives, how do they actually know that they're moving in the right direction, as we have discussed? So this presentation is like a sequel from the 2021 summit. So I'm curious, maybe online, give a thumbs up if you were at the 2021 summit and in the room, raise your hand. Okay, yeah. So this is a sequel to that presentation. We're about 60% of the way through this transformation. It's a multi-year focused on payments. And in that presentation, I shared with you all how we use business architecture to rationalize over 250 processes. There were close to 1,800 activities. I mean, like thousands of activities, and looked at various controls, risk, job titles, thousands of data elements, and then the organizational structure. And we simplified the view. We created 17 blueprints that were aligned under one value stream, about 40 capabilities. We also rationalized their controls. There was a lot of redundancy. 7 organizations, 23 stakeholders. So instead of all those job titles, we helped them understand how to look at it and understand functionally what those stakeholders, how they contributed to the value stream. And we also looked at ways to, look horizontally and come up with ways to structure the organization so that it operated more efficiently. And then also the information concepts, about 20 information concepts as well. So today I'm going to focus mainly on capabilities, organization, initiatives, metrics, and strategy. And I'm going to take you through my journey of how we were able to ensure that what we are building is going to achieve the outcomes. So I'm sure you all recognize, these various components or domains and the relationship between each one of them. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. It will take too long, but I'm one of those people that has to, I like structure, and I like to make sure that things connect, and you'll be able to connect the dots. I'm just a little bit more of a rule follower, so you can blame my mother for that. But what I want to focus on is the objectives and the strategy. So strategies, in order to achieve those strategies, you have to have clear objectives. And to know how far you're going to go, you have to have clear goals. And then metrics will help you to understand how you measure those goals. You've got to target the right capabilities. And then as you understand what those capabilities are, then the initiatives that you launch need to make sure that you're understand how they're impacting those various capabilities. The analogy that I like to use is, if you think about hire someone to charter a plane and you say you don't know what your destination is. That's like having an objective, a strategy without objectives. Well, let's say you now know where you're going. You have the plane and you're going to, determine your destination, but you don't know what you're going to do when you get there. Well, that's like having a strategy without goals. Or if you get to your destination and you say, okay, these are the things that I want to accomplish. And you have maybe 20 things you want to accomplish, but you didn't say how long, what you need to do. That's like having objectives without goals or metrics. So it's really important that all three of those components are connected. So some of the challenges that we had with establishing our goals and metrics, and I'm sure this happens in your organization, is that we didn't necessarily track all of our goals and metrics or have even benchmark data that we could feel confident in using. And so what we agreed to do is to basically establish a target date to baseline those metrics and then to begin monitoring and reporting and trending in those. And then once we get to a flat line, that will give us an indication to do an assessment to determine whether we have met that goal. The other thing was because of using the agile approach, there was the realization date for some of the goals felt like it was a little bit of a moving target. And most have heard a couple of you talk about that as well. And so what we did was, two things. As with agile, you do create roadmaps, but we wanted to make sure we extended ours out and did multi-year roadmaps, and then targeted the deployment of the improvements to the capabilities that were going to address those objectives to kind of project what our realization date would be. And then the other thing we did is created critical milestones just to make sure that we were on track for those. So as we began our journey, the initiatives that we formulated that we wanted to launch, we needed to make sure that we're investing in the right initiatives so that we could realize those objectives. And so for each one of those objectives that were defined, we created a transformation charter. So there were 8 initiatives that were defined for this payments transformation. And in those, we used the construct of, OKRs, your objectives, your key results. And so as part of that, for example, one of our key objectives, as with most financial service companies across the world, is that we want to have frictionless payments. So that was a key objective. In order to achieve that objective, we needed to reduce manual touches. And so as we looked at our initiatives, we needed to make sure that those initiatives did invest in achieving that particular objective. And so unless there was a targeted capability, so an example would be payment validation or, payment creation, to make sure that that particular capability was targeted in order to reduce our manual touches and achieve the overall objective of frictionless payments. So once we, determined what those key objectives were, we now needed to start to determine what the metrics are, like what activities did we need to measure in order to determine that they would, our investments, and that it would be effective. So we started to look at what are the organizations that are that deliver those capabilities that we are going to be targeting for each one of those initiatives. And the metrics then we started to define. So remember on that first second slide, I think, where I kind of showed the context, the organization, and what our primary drivers were. So customer experience and operational efficiency. So just as an example, those were two primary drivers. And so we started to build out what we were going to measure, clarified what those activities were that we wanted to measure to ensure that the investments were effective. So an example, as we started to build out our OKRs, we needed to define, what was the current value for the ones that we were currently measuring, and then what's the desired value, and by when do we expect to achieve that. And as we were building out those metrics, we can't do that just as our project team. And so this is where we also looked at the organizations that contributed to those metrics. And so the organizations, as we looked at those, there were times where there was more than one organization that would need to make a commitment to that metric. And so we cross-mapped all of the organizations to the metrics. And then anytime there was a collaboration needed, we made sure that those organizations came together and agreed upon what that target would be. And just a word of advice, when we were building these out, it was, I wanted to always to go as high in the organization as I could. So working with, the chief, usually one down, like from the chief technology officer. So anyone, any of my metrics that had to do with, throughput that required, enhancements to the technology, or the operations that, had that actually processed the payment. So the head of the wires operations, to make sure that I had top down, but then also validate that at various levels. They know strategically where they need to go, but you also need to be to involve some of the individuals within their areas that actually do the work, which is very important. So earlier I mentioned that determining when we were achieve those objectives was really important, and that we needed to know which capabilities were tied to each one of the objectives. And so the initiatives were, we built roadmaps for each one of those initiatives. And those multi-year roadmaps, we then did pinpoint when were we going to deliver the capability that needed to, that we were improving in order to achieve those outcomes. Because often that those things can kind of shift to the left. So we wanted to, shift to the right, I should say. So we wanted to make sure that we had pinpointed when those would be delivered. Next, we started to look at aligning those organizations that were accountable for those goals and objectives and agree upon the timing. So the organizations that we'd cross-mapped to each one of those metrics, and now that we've built those multi-year roadmaps and have pinpointed when that capability instance was going to be approved, we then built this table that, again, PowerPoint, nothing fancy, but built this table of our 22 metrics and created a chart that tells us for each one of those when we expect to realize each one of those metrics. And those organizations that were responsible, again, for delivering, they actually delivered the capability. Their initiatives that we had launched were impacting the capabilities that needed to be improved, had to agree upon that timeline. So in terms of making a commitment to when you're going to realize those goals, as I mentioned, sometimes when you are doing a large scale transformation, that's a multi-year journey, things can continue to shift to the right. And so it was important for us to establish critical milestones to make sure that we were moving, enhancing the capabilities and moving towards achieving those goals. So as an example, because all of my target state and a lot of my target state capability instance improvements weren't being remediated on the current system that we're on. We're changing our technology stack. So unless we moved the transactions that were being processed to this new target state, we wouldn't realize the benefits. And so what we did is we started to look at, well, how, at what percentage and at what time can we start to move the transactions over to this new target state technology? That capability instance is going to be improved, and let's set milestones. So, but like, for instance, by the end of 2021, we expect to have 10% of the volume on this new technology. By the end of 2022, 45%, and then by the end of 2023, all the transactions will now be on the target state, and that's where the capability is being enhanced, and now we can realize the benefits. So it's important to hold people accountable for achieving those critical milestones in order to achieve the long-term metric that contributes to your objectives. Another aspect of defining these metrics was to understand the relationship between them, like which ones supported each other. So a couple of the efficiency metrics were really important. So let's just go back to the example of frictionless payments. So in order to achieve frictionless payments, I mentioned we needed to reduce the manual touches or manual reviews. And also by reducing the manual reviews, we also looked at how we could reduce the cycle time. Those two metrics, unless they were realized, we couldn't reduce our operational efficiency. So understanding the relationship between the metrics is very important, because there's maybe different capabilities tied to each one of those. And so having a way to monitor and make sure that we're achieving the improvements that we needed for each of the capabilities tied to those three metrics is really important, so that we can realize all of the goals and outcomes. So in the end, to kind of summarize all of the metrics and the goals, what I also wanted to do was to see if there were any gaps. So the 8 initiatives that we had, I laid those out with all of the metrics, and then created this table to say, there is one of the initiatives that actually hasn't committed to any goals or objectives, and review this with our senior leaders to say, are you okay with that? I can't get, this group to commit to any measurable goals. And honestly, that's where we're at right now. They will not commit to it. I mean, I was like, do you spend I can't say them out, this much money on this without saying, that we're going to see a return. So without telling on them, I told on them. So that's one view, and I think it's really important. And of course, we know that metrics are not all equally weighted, and so a way to look at cost versus benefits. And so basically, for each one of the initiatives, being able to quantify how much we're spending over the multi-year journey. Now we have the metrics, we have the quantifiable benefits, some of them, again, operational expense reduction. And so being able to lay that out, also to show, you can see for the first 3 years, there is no quantifiable return on the investment. And so this was used to be able to demonstrate that. And then if you think back to, again, some of the relationships that business architecture allows you to draw between, the capabilities and the organizations. Now, if there are questions that come up about why aren't we returning these, why aren't we seeing a return on these investments? We now can actually target the specific organizations, specific metrics and capabilities. And, if you have to have a meeting to have that discussion, you're not wasting the time of everybody on the transformation it's like, hey, I know exactly who to invite to this meeting. These are the resources that need to be there. These are the leaders I need at the table in order to have that discussion. So in summary, it is very important to have linkages and alignment to your objectives, the initiatives that achieve your strategies and goals. Make sure you identify the organizations that deliver the capabilities impacted by the initiatives. And then to also define the objectives, goals, and metrics, and also agree upon the timing for the benefits realization. Initiatives also have to clearly define the goals, metrics, and KPIs to measure the effectiveness of the investments that yield the return on the investment. And again, because if you're doing large-scale transformations, think about how you can establish critical milestones for some of those longer range goals to keep targeted on the benefits realization date and keep that on track. With that, I will.
You make it look easy. I'm guessing there's some questions. You want to start, Ruth?
Sure. Did you have leading and lagging KPIs?
Trying to think, I don't necessarily. No, we didn't really have any leading and lagging. I'm trying to think of, no, not in particular.
Okay. Did you use the balanced scorecard in developing the metrics?
We did not use the balanced scorecard.
How are folks being held accountable? That was also on the slide where
Yeah. The way
we told on them.
Yeah, the way they're being held accountable is that we have a council that meets bi-weekly to review the metrics, the outcomes, and that is part of the review. But because we're about 60% of the way through the transformation, and as I mentioned, a lot of the outcomes are not going to be realized until the end of the transformation, which is 2025. And then some of the other benefits also, because of contractual agreements, we won't see even till, a year or two after. So there's not a lot other than those critical milestones that are leading up to us realizing those we do monitor and report out on.
Another one? Sure. How do you measure or track intangible metrics / KPIs, such as improving self-service capabilities?
Well, so if you have a capability that is not, that you currently don't have self-service for, so like we do have like payment tracker that allows us customers to go out and actually see their transactions. And so one of the ways that so in terms of internally, we know the number of users that access that internal tracking tool. So we're at a couple of thousand. So that's one way that we know we've got a bigger user base. And then as far as externally customers, I haven't specifically talk with my team because that's going to be the organizations that actually work directly service the customers. We're creating an API so that the customers can access it. And I would say probably the simplest way to do is to be able to track how many customers actually log in, take advantage of that self-service. So that's probably the simplest way to do that. But we haven't built, we're building the API. It's on our roadmap right now.
Hi. Yeah, I had a question about the OKRs. Did you do anything where you tried to associate the OKR to the capability and then do any work around trying to validate the delivery of the OKR through the capability?
Yes, we did associate the OKR to the capability because we had to know that objective, so like the objective of frictionless payment had to tie to a capability around payment validation. So that was important that we knew, because then otherwise we wouldn't be able to say, well, this is the capability that you're going to improve at this time. So that was part of our planning.
Thank you for the presentation. Just give us a lot of ideas. Question on estimate cost. It's kind of easy. Pretty much all of us estimate costs for the initiatives just to get the initiatives approved and move forward. Benefits, and we have chat some about benefits. I have chat with some of the guys here in the room. Benefits is more complex, right? Especially if you are doing the planning or doing the business architecture or something that is going to be achieved in 1 year, 2 years. How can you establish a mechanism to follow up all those initiatives, even when those initiatives are finished, and continue follow up the results of that in years to make sure to say, you know what, we are achieving, we are harvest the benefits that we plan at the beginning.
Yeah, we don't know yet because we're not there,
Okay.
but well, a couple of things. One is some of the metrics, as I mentioned, I try to go as high as I can in the organization to gain accountability. And so one of them is she runs all of the enterprise wires operations. And so we're incorporating those metrics into her dashboard. They have a Tableau dashboard. So that's one way. Some of them are just going to become a part of their BAU. The other ones that we don't necessarily report on, especially the technology saves, it's, those, a lot of those are, like I said, even 2 years after because of contractual agreements with vendors. I don't know because I may not even still be there, but we'll figure out. We know when we expect to achieve those benefits. It's on our CEO reports. And so I'm sure there's a lot of eyes on seeing that come to fruition. Yeah, good question.
My question is, do you have an automated tool for tracking your OKRs, and what do you use as a business architecture tool for your capabilities?
So right now they're in 2 places, and I love the answers from before, Excel and PowerPoint. But some of them, as I mentioned, we're going to be putting them in a Tableau. Some of the parts of the organization also use like MicroStrategy, but Tableau is going to be where some of those reports, some of those metrics will be stored.
Hi, Teresa. So do you own the goals, objectives, or OKRs, or do you help facilitate the conversation? And how did you get a seat at the table? Because that's not always easy.
Yeah. So I facilitated all the conversations with the various transformation leaders. So I had all of my product owners, initiative leads, this like sponsor, and then working with like the head of technology, with 2 down from the technology, because I'm like, you have to agree. And I needed information from him about, well, when do these contracts expire? What is your total cost of ownership? But they are all part of, having that dialogue. So, this is a large scale. So think about payments for a financial services company. It's a core competency, and it really wasn't hard to get their attention. So because of the money we're investing in and the importance of it as well.
Thank you. Is this framework used across the organization or just for this transformation?
It is not, as I mentioned, our business architecture practice is sort of done in pockets. It is not necessarily done across the organization. I have seen some of my other peers, especially in the commercial banking, that I see as probably just as mature and doing this type of at least, structured approach and cross mapping and understanding relationships, not necessarily calling it the same thing, but very similar discipline.
Does everyone in the organization understand and use KPIs, or is it only with the strategic team? And how did you create awareness on the KPIs?
Well, the company is really big on the OKRs. And so as part of your key results, you do have to define those metrics, right? Like, where are you currently, where are you going, and by when? And so that is part of the organization, and pretty much anyone who's got a large scale transformation or initiative that they have to do that. And then how did I create awareness? Part of it is just in our, standard meetings, the councils, and the various forums that I help set the agenda for. So, yeah.
How do you take into account the impact of each initiative on people, the change impact? This is a very important consideration in my view that should be considered.
Well, part of as it relates to the metrics, well, part of it is, a couple of things. And I really didn't talk about this, but I do have a process engineer that does, for each of our releases, we do an impact assessment of all of the, what capabilities that we're going to impact. And we look at our process inventory and determine what the impact is going to be based on the processes that are connected to that particular release. And then it really depends, because if we're changing a capability, maybe automating something, we had an opportunity where we were enhancing how we did like our duplicate detection, and that was going to increase volume because we're at more robust rules. And so I worked with the team to determine, well, what do you project that volume to be? How long does it take? Do we have the capacity to do that? But I would say we use a process component as a lens to figure out what the impact is going to be to the employee.
Are these leaders, are they incentivized to achieve these key results? Is that tied in there too? Is there incentive, are they tied together?
Yes, I would say so, because we just wrote our goals for using these metrics and goals. I know I'm holding my team accountable. It's in our goals and objectives. I haven't seen the actual, some of my technology leads, but I mean, they're common goals around customer experience, operational efficiency that just typically are just, part of the normal, desire for the organization just to be more efficient. And we actually, who was a gentleman before, risk management, we just started also doing KRIs that, the key risk indicators, also because of a lot of the regulatory scrutiny. So one of the things that I did, I didn't show it here, is that I took all those 22 metrics and I took our KRIs and cross-mapped them. And so there's probably, 40 to 50% of the our metrics were also tied to a KRI. So that also incentivizes them to achieve those.
Okay, any more? Oh, we got one last question over there.
Pass your mic back. 2 rows.
You mentioned that the metrics, the KPIs are tied back to your capabilities. Curious as to whether you use a capability framework, and do senior leaders look at capability maturity over time, based on those metrics?
So we just no. So the leaders don't, we just introduced a business platform and product architecture, BPPA, that's based on buy-in and another capability. So they've kind of merged those. We are using that on our transformation sort of loosely, but we don't have as a mature capability map as we used to. So, but yes, it's the same, a similar concept. They don't, yeah, anyway.
Okay, well, who knew metrics could be so exciting? But
Yeah.
thanks so much, Teresa.